Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lee Panglia, and I'm delighted to be hosting today's session as part of our Returning to the Workplace series, where we'll explore how to rebuild trust and how best to tackle any potentially simmering tensions in the workplace following a return to the workplace. You'll see from my title that I head up the CIPD in Scotland and Northern Ireland, but for the avoidance of any doubt, because I have been asked this in previous webinars, what we're discussing today is applicable to all our members, wherever you're dialing in from, not just those of you that are joining us from Scotland and Northern Ireland. If we think over the past year, or actually a bit longer than the past year, we've seen frontline workers responding flat out to the pandemic, while others have been forced into home working and a number of workers placed on furlough. Each of us, though, playing a significant role in the UK's response to the pandemic. As the workforce slowly begins to come back together in whatever shape, it's important for us to recognise that each individual's experience has been unique, and that the impact on high workloads, potential redundancies that have taken place, and burnout for some may well have impacted morale, commitment, and for some it may well have eroded trust in their employers. So today what we're going to do is explore what factors employers need to consider when reintroducing, reintegrating what some are referring to as a split workforce, and how best to manage expectations. So considering how we ensure that rebuilding trust and working relationships are at the very heart of our return to the workplace, and whatever form that takes. And so that you can make the best decisions for your organisation and for your workforce. So today I'm delighted to introduce three speakers. Our panel of three speakers, and each of them brings a different perspective to the discussion. Each speaker has a particularly impressive biography, and if I was to share it all of them, it would take up the whole session. So just to summarise, I would like to first of all introduce my colleague David D'Souza, who is CIPD's Director of Membership. Prior to joining the CIPD, David has a wealth of experience, mostly in financial services and retail sectors. He brings lots to this discussion, but I think in particular, his experience around organisational development and culture, corporate ethics and employee engagement, I think are areas of particular relevance to the discussion today. Secondly, I'd like to introduce Professor Ros Searle. Ros holds the chair in Human Resource Management and Occupational Psychology at the Adam Smith Business School in the University of Glasgow. Ros is a chartered occupational psychologist. She's a fellow of the BPS, of the RSA, and she's also an academic fellow of the CIPD. One of Rosie's main areas of research is the impact of change on organisational trust, and in particular the role of the HRM process in that. And then last but not least, I'd like to introduce Andy Dodman, who is the Chief HR Officer for Leeds City Council, which is the UK's second largest local authority, which I didn't realise. Andy is responsible for people strategy and HR service delivery for all 14,500 staff directly employed by the council, but also around 12,000 employed by primary and secondary schools. Prior to joining local government in 2019, Andy worked in higher education. He was a Chief Operating Officer for the University of Sheffield. And Andy is a Chartered Fellow of the CIPD. So just quickly, before I go any further, there's some practical housekeeping rules that I need to go through with you. Attendees are all muted. The session is being recorded and will be available on demand via the webinar section of the CIPD website, where you can access all previous webinar recordings, but you can also sign up for future ones too. Our next webinar is on the 13th of May, and it's on fairness and reward and recognition post-COVID-19. So it's focusing on the unequal impact of the pandemic, with the unequal impact that the pandemic has had on the workforce to date, and what employers could be doing or should be doing to ensure fairer reward and recognition post-pandemic. To submit questions to the panel, please type into the Q&A box, not the chat box. You can use the chat box to network with each other and post observations, but any questions, please post them into the Q&A box. Before I introduce the speakers to share their insight, I'd like to draw your attention to some of our member benefits, and in particular, some of those additional resources that you may not already be aware of that can support you in the role. Of particular interest, I would like to continue to highlight our COVID-19 resources. They are updated frequently. We're always updating the FAQs and do so after each of these webinars. So I would encourage you to continue to visit our Coronavirus Hub. Also, I'd like to draw attention to the fact that the CIPD members get individual legal advice by calling our HR Inform helpline. It's available 24/7. And then finally, with regards to our member benefits, I would like to point out that all CIPD members in the UK and Ireland can also access our new Wellbeing Hub and helpline. Together with award-winning workplace wellbeing provider Health Assured, we now provide CIPD members with free help and support 24/7, 365 days a year via telephone or online consultations with qualified therapists. All of our members can access the phone number and the online services via the membership benefits webpage. And you'll see more details of this at the end of our session. Next, let's get on to the content of the discussion. David will be our first speaker, and he'll share CIPD's position on trust and return to the workplace, followed by Ros, who will explore how distrust may have built up over the course of the pandemic and how organisations can rebuild that trust. Then Andy, last but not least, will share some practical insight from how Leeds City Council has been managing a multi-layered workforce and maintaining trust throughout. We'll then open up for questions for the remainder of the session. So if I can encourage you, as I said earlier, to post your questions into the Q&A function. And we'll aim to get through as many questions as we can after the speakers have shared their insight. So that's it from me. I'm going to hand over to David now. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name's David D'Souza and I'm Membership Director at the CIPD. The CIPD's position on trust is probably quite an obvious one. Trust's a good thing. It's very useful in organisations. Societally, it's absolutely imperative. And in fact, as a species, it's probably one of the most important things we have. It's what allows us to thrive, and it allows us to thrive more effectively than almost anything else because of the ability for us to work together reliably and collaborate. Without trust, collaboration is nearly impossible. It's what allows us to deliver. And we've gone through a period in the last year where there's been incredible trauma, incredible stress, and at times significant division. And certainly politically, you'd take that back as a kind of broader window of disagreement. And when you add all those things together, it becomes absolutely imperative for organisations to have the trust that allows knowledge to flow effectively through organisations and up and down, to allow people to express their voices and bring their talents and their skills to the organisation in the most inclusive way possible. And also for people to maintain a sense of trust and relationship with the organisation. And the interesting thing about organisational trust is that it manifests in a number of different ways. So do you trust your organisation is a multifaceted question, because to some extent you might trust that the organisation will do something consistently, but you won't necessarily trust the intent that sits behind it. Or you might trust the organisation as a whole, but you don't trust the colleagues that you work with, or quite often you might trust possibly the organisation and your colleagues, but your boss, you really have a problem with your boss and you don't trust that they have your best interests at heart. You don't trust that actually they want your career to flourish. You don't trust they're not taking credit for your work. All of those things happen to a greater or lesser degree in most organisations. But when you're living in a time where actually we're told that we can't trust the press, or people distrust the information they're being given by medical professionals, then absolutely understanding the impact of that on an organisation and what you might need to better do to deliver an environment where people can trust each other and know the intent of each other and operate well together is absolutely key to organisations. So whether you are an organisation that intends to keep people working remotely and you have challenges or issues with trust within that or with the organisation's relationship with them, or whether you're an organisation that actually is starting to bring people back together and you're finding they've had profoundly different experiences, it's a really important period for us to tease apart trust a bit more and understand how the social dynamics of organisations work. So there's a really good example, I think, around the framing of organisations that you'll find in Dan Airley's work, who has a brilliant job. He heads up the Centre for Advanced Hindsight at Duke University, which is the best name for anything ever. And he talks about the difference between financial and social transactions and how often we cross them, and that creates an issue for trust. And many organisations will have seen it this year. So you start off your positioning as an employer quite positively. We're a family. We like people to feel part of things, like we're a family here. And then actually someone needs to go off because they're sick or they're absent, and suddenly they find there's an impact on their pay or their job security. Well, you don't do that with family members. You frame that relationship in one way, and the reality of that is turning up in a very different way. And trust at its heart relies on a few things. And I know Ros will go into far greater detail around some of the psychology and some of the research, but it relies on a congruence of values quite often. So I trust you to do the right thing is a really helpful thing, rather than I trust you to do the wrong thing. We normally implicitly say when we trust someone that we're trusting their intent aligns with ours, or their intent will at least be positive. But the second thing that I think often isn't focused on enough is that it also relies on consistency. That I can rely on you to come up with the same kind of decisions or the same kind of efforts or the same kind of determinations that you would have done yesterday, tomorrow. And if you can't find that in your organisation, if there's an inconsistency of approach in values, then it becomes impossible for trust to flourish. Because if I turn up each day and I don't know how you're going to be with me, either at an organisational level or in terms of my team or in terms of my boss, it's incredibly, incredibly challenging to try and build any trust in that space. So there's that wonderful thing in organisations that exist in a kind of them and us. So they don't understand what's going on. They're not interested in our welfare. They don't really care. And the challenge for HR is to serve the interests of the organisation and the people in it in such a way that we don't become they. We don't become the they that people are talking about in organisations. They don't get it, they don't care, isn't something that you want associated with HR, but we're also brokering a relationship between the organisation and the individuals within it at times. So there's a number of things that can break trust, and that's quite often a useful way of looking at how you make trust. So as you're thinking about your next year and as you're thinking about how you're progressing, how are you going to make sure that you articulate the decisions that you have within the organisations in such a way to create trust in those values and in the consistency of applications? What does that look like in terms of the policies that you might create, or in terms of the principles that you might want to operate in the organisation? And again, in terms of the consistency of application. In terms of your leadership, how do you create a space where actually they are clear on what they stand for? People can rely on them, again, that consistency piece. But also, interestingly, far more importantly, because we've talked about psychological safety a lot for the last year, how do you create a trust that there are spaces where people are psychologically safe and can voice their concerns in a constructive way? So if you really want an organisation to be the most productive that it can be, you need to maximise the contribution that's possible from people. And lack of trust is a complete barrier to that. So HR have got a role to play on reflecting on what things we can do that will either help or hinder the process of creation of trust within organisations. And that starts from the very start of the employment relationship. Have you been honest in your advertising? Are you bringing people in on a salary that's going to be congruent and fair within the kind of organisation that you're working in? And how, after that point, do you communicate and support people and the people that create teams and environments within the organisation to be fair? So what's changed over the last year? A lot has changed in terms of the external environment and the sense of stability that we have. If you want to bring that stability back into your workforce, then it's really important that as HR, we understand the role that we play within that, but also that we aren't the entire party. The leadership team have got a part to play in that. Line management has got an absolutely key role to play in that. Because with the exception of a very few niche organisations, trust is a genuine hygiene factor in terms of performance and in terms of the ability to deliver. There are some environments where you don't want people to be overly trusting. Espionage would be a good example of that. You sort of want people to understand to spot a lie. If you work in fraud prevention, you probably want people who are quite suspecting. But in most environments, you want the starting point to be one of trust in your colleagues, trust that the organisation will do the right thing, and trust that that will be reliable and consistent. And getting people into a position where they build that trust through working together, through examining the boundaries of it, and through communicating clearly is absolutely something that HR can have a clear and hugely important role to play. But the other thing that I'll throw in before I kind of hand over to Ros is that reputationally and professionally, there's a barrier to that, which is that quite often HR is seen as on the side of the organisation rather than the individual. And that is a perception that the only way you can shift over time, the only way you can genuinely get movement and momentum on that is by being different. So creating an environment where actually people can trust in and will come to HR and be psychologically safe and feel that that's an environment they can talk and speak up in and be treated fairly in the same way you would want from the leadership team. So I think as a profession, we have a historical challenge that we need to meet up. So I do understand, having worked in a range of different organisations, why people might be sceptical and mistrust HR. So we've got that to deal with, I guess, on our own front lawn, where we have a broader challenge and a broader opportunity to help drive, curate and support more trust within organisations, particularly for those of you who are working in areas of knowledge work where teamwork is critical. It's impossible to be at your best if people don't trust each other and they don't trust the responses that they'll get around them. Hugely important thing for us to deliver. I know Ros will talk more about some of the research that sits behind it, and Andy will talk about some of the practical things that they've been doing there. But I look forward to joining in the chat at the end to try and bring things together. But I trust that you'll have an excellent rest of the webinar.
Thank you, David, for that, for sharing some of the challenges and opportunities that HR face in brokering a relationship between the organisation and the individual within each organisation, and delivering that environment where people can trust each other to collaborate, communicate, and I guess deliver productively, as you've said. So now I'd like to hand over to Ros, who's going to share a little bit more around the evidence and insight. Thank you, Ros.
Thank you very much, and thank you, CIPD, for giving me an opportunity to wear a dress, because we have to take these small bonuses. So what I'm going to be talking about here, building on what David was talking about, is really an idea about preserving trust. So it's all very well to think about building trust and repairing trust, but I actually think we've got a really important mandate here, particularly as HR professionals, in terms of preserving trust and paying attention to what currently is happening within the business. Can I have the next slide, please? So the return to work is going to be a very anxiety-provoking situation for a number of people. I was talking to a friend over the weekend who had been back in at work last week and ended up uncharacteristically dissolving into tears. And she was really shocked by her reaction. She was also really shocked that nobody around her kind of came and connected and helped. So she is now coming back into work, again, with another big question mark going on in her head about, is this the workplace that I expected it to be? Is this somewhere that I want to remain working in? And I think for a number of people, this is likely to be the case. Next slide, please. So if we look here, trust really becomes to the fore in situations where we have uncertainty and disruption, which, I mean, the pandemic has done this to everybody with knobs on, but also where we have a heightened sense of vulnerability. And that can make us, because we are human animals, it can make us very, very focused on keeping safe, as David highlighted. But that really is very important because it gives us a focus that's about that safety issue. And in particular, that means that we pay attention to things that have gone wrong, things that have been negative, because those are likely to make us feel unsafe. So trust is really a very salient issue. Now, if we think, I'm going to be highlighting some 3 key issues here. So let's think about the experiences of the pandemic, which my next slide has on them. And for many people, it's been this kind of skydiving experience in the sense of out of the plane, not quite knowing what's going to happen, and then trying to link up with people in different ways. You'll see on my next slide, what I've got here is a synthesis of some research that we did a while ago on looking at how do people in organisations respond to change and particularly crisis. And you can see we've got the top team in one of the corners where people are working together, and we found that this group were able to maintain trust. They worked together, they communicated, they shared the values, and they made sure that they were able to operate effectively. But I think that is often a rarity, particularly in the pandemic. But I think also we have to remember that many of the people who have come together to form teams to help organisations deliver in these times actually are very tired and have been doing that, if you like, by kind of holding on by their fingertips to the situation. So that may not be sustainable. So they may have been a team, but they're a very tired team now, and we need to come back and think about that. So you'll see then down, if you go on the diagonal, you see the person uncovering the question mark. We call these watchful followers. So these are people that have noticed that something isn't quite right and they are alert. But the key issue for this group of employees is that they need a conversation about that concern and then the resolution of that, and then they'll flip back into being a truster. But if you don't have that conversation, then they're going to be thinking, are there any more things under this carpet that you're not telling me about? So again, we'll be focusing on that. Then in the middle of the screen, you saw the person with the big X. That is somebody who's really registered that it's the leaders in this organization, as David alluded to earlier, that really haven't stepped up. They really haven't done things. We're a great organization. It's these people that are in charge of us that we have to be very wary about. And the messages that they need are going to be very different. Then the person in the middle there with the big question mark coming out from them, we call these concerned loyalists. So these are people who notice something isn't quite right in your organization and they need to be heard. They want to share those concerns. They want to tell you about things that aren't going right so that trust can be preserved, but also so that things will not spiral out of control for them and for other people. So they're really a hugely important resource to make sure that you're listening and trying to see where are the people coming from this from. Then the person with the job bit, well, they're the person who they kind of understood what their job is, and now they really don't, because all of the pandemic, all of the way of working means that they don't quite understand, how do I do this when I used to do that in the old world, as it were. So again, we call these identity shifters, and their concerns are quite different. There may be a whole group of people around them who are feeling the same way and are starting to doubt and disconnect. But again, these people need to be listened to. They need to help to make that bridge into trusting again. And then in the top corner, you can see we've got somebody exploding. These are angry distrusters. These are a very small group of people that we found in our research, but they are very negative. They've often been on a journey through some of the bits in the middle of this diagram, and they finally ended up in this point where they're often stuck record in the organisation, so people have stopped listening to them, which actually makes them very isolated and can make them quite dangerous in terms of what they could do to harm the organisation or other people in it. But these people have really changed from trust into distrust. And as a result of that, it's very hard to pull them back, because suddenly they're not able to segment and see things in a proportionate way. They tend to be much more extreme with this distrusting. Now, these angry distrusters is a really exhausting place to be, So what we find is that either people leave the organisation or they drop down into that bottom little person that we call the apathetic, who sadly has to stay in the organisation, often from pensions and other issues that constrain and make them have to stay, even though they actually don't want to, and they're very disconnected. And they're not really interested in trust because they just want to leave the organisation ultimately. But the reason that I've put all of these up is to remind you about what is the communication that's going on in your business. Have you understood where are these different groups? Because I will guarantee that it's about segmenting that communication, it's about listening and understanding. And if you're able to do that, it will make that return to work so much more helpful for people because they'll feel that the things that they're concerned about are being addressed. Next slide, please. So what this has really underscored is the emotion and the issue of dynamics of emotion. So as I mentioned earlier on, this friend who was returning to work suddenly finding themselves on this kind of emotional roller coaster that they really weren't expecting. And so you'll see on the next slide, what we find in these events is that you tend to get these two different types of negative emotions. So one is all about fear and anxiety, and that shuts down our thinking and makes us pull away from things so that we can avoid and try and get away. But the second emotion that we can often find ourselves in is anger. Anger, why was I put in this position? Anger about the situation. And that is a mobilizer. So it makes people want to engage, to fight back and push. Now, the reason that I mention these two emotions is that they're really important in fueling counterproductive work behaviours. They're really important in fueling moral disengagement, which allows people to do bad stuff, but feel vindicated in doing it and that they were right to do it. So again, we've got to pay attention to the emotions that people are feeling. If you look at the next slide, this is a study that we did, and I'll put the resources for you to look at. And what we identified here were these three specific aspects that leaders and HR need to do. And you'll see the second one of those is what's called emotional embodying. And what this is about recognizing that people have these very strong emotions, particularly at the moment, and helping them work through it. If you look at the next slide, this practice is all about helping people manage their vulnerability. And it's a mechanism about getting them to acknowledge their emotions. And as I said earlier on, that might be a real surprise to them that they're feeling this strength of emotion, but it has to be dissipated in a particular way. So it's about helping people to recognize that they're going to have an emotional response so that they're not shocked and surprised and feel let down by themselves. But it's also helping them work through these things. And that can involve coaching, it can involve reminding people to look after each other. And particularly what we find in terms of trust and organisational trust is that benevolent respect is about showing people that you care about them. And I think really critically in terms of helping them with their emotions. Next slide, please. So if you like, as a call to arms, I think that HR has a really critical role and actually a very unique and special role in managing this transition back into work. Next slide, please. It's all about helping organisations to be resilient organisations, to be able to preserve the trust that they have within them, but also it's about helping them to do that in a dynamic way and a way that happens over time. So in particular, there may be small groups of people within your workplace who suddenly have realised that they have a whole range of skills that they never thought that they had. They've learned so much more about themselves and their resilience and what they can offer. But there will also be a lot of people who are wobbling and who are very damaged by their experiences that may relate to nothing that's happened within their work situations. So I think here, particularly thinking about mental health and mental health first aiders is critically important. Now, I know that you've got something coming up that's looking at wages, and in particular, the fairness around wages is a really important issue in terms of restoring, but it's not just about getting back to the normal. Next slide, please. So on this slide, I've created some resources that you'll be able to have a look at. And the top one is a free animation that builds on what I talked about earlier. And then the middle one is a free and very practice-orientated paper all around preserving trust in organisations. I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Ros, for sharing so much insight and so much content for us to consider around the importance of understanding our employees' pandemic experience. I love the idea of segmenting your workforce and understanding how to communicate better with it. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions around that later on. But if I could pass on to Andy now to share his experiences of late. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lee, and good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody is well. So as Lee rightly says, what I want to do is just share with you a fairly brief case study of the work we're doing here at Leeds City Council around our future working arrangements. Before I get on to the case study and some of the practical application, just a very quick bit of background from me first. So on the next slide, you'll just see a bit about myself and Leeds City Council. So I'm the Chief HR Officer at the Council. I'm recently appointed as the Vice President of the PPMA, which is the Public Service People Managers Association, which is a professional HR body that represents public sector HR people. As Lee mentioned at the start of the session, Leeds City Council, you can see where I work in the lovely building of the Civic Hall in the centre of Leeds. We're the second largest local authority in the UK, and when you add in the staff that we directly employ together with our primary and secondary schools across the city, we do employ around 27,000 staff. As some of you know, when you talk to people about working for a council, they always assume that we're the people that have to worry about potholes and emptying bins, which is true, we do that. And indeed, we empty about 2 million bins a year in the city. As a large council, of course, we do run a whole range of other services as well. So there's something like 450 different services we provide to our local communities. And that's everything from sort of the A to Z. So A in terms of our adoption services, and up to Z, we do employ some zookeepers. So we're a very broad and quite complicated organisation. So just in terms of our future working arrangements, so we launched a programme in early March of this year. And probably the first thing to stress to everybody on this is that we really wanted to spend a fair bit of time talking to our workforce really about the drivers for the change. So we didn't just want the change to be described within the remit of the immediate in-year response to COVID. And obviously the pandemic has acted as a real catalyst on a lot of the change that colleagues have already talked about. But it's really recognising that we've been on this journey actually as large employers for some time anyway. So we spent a fair bit of time talking about those other big drivers for change across the city and across the organisation, whether they're sort of demographic changes, behaviours, our customer expectations, of course, are changing. We have a whole range of different financial challenges, socio-economic factors, political factors, you name it. So we've been focusing very much on presenting, if you like, that much bigger, broader context of change within the workplace, rather than an in-year response to the pandemic. We tried to present a lot of our thinking, a lot of our practical application in that kind of transformational, longer-term programme of change and activity. And often when we're talking to staff about this, some of the narrative we've been using is not just talking about place of work, but much more about the future of work. So I often say to staff that whilst we are interested in talking to you about where you'll be working in the future, sort of post-pandemic, we often say it's as important that we talk to you about how you'll be working, not just where you'll be working. So that's sort of some of the common themes and common narratives that we are really sort of introducing and talking quite openly and directly to our staff about. Just in terms of the journey and the activities, on the next slide, you'll see really quite a busy slide, so apologies for this. This is effectively a bit of some YouTube videos that were produced for our workforce, which effectively is an animation taking our staff through the journey that we would like them to go through between now or March when we started this, probably up to June and July and beyond. Because of time, I can't show you the animation, so you've got in front of you just a screenshot of it, and it is quite a busy slide. But that's a key thing just to draw your attention to is if you like that middle row, and you can see a big blue triangle in the middle of it. And effectively, that is a key issue here for us because this recognises that we're not a homogenous workforce as a large employer. And we do employ people right across the city, but engage in a whole range of different working environments and, of course, working patterns. So, of course, we've got a lot of frontline staff who've been working really flat out throughout the last 12 months of the COVID pandemic, our frontline staff. But, of course, we've had lots of staff who've been peripatetic, those working in and out of the community. And of course, we've got lots of individuals who are working in our partner organisations, whether that's the NHS. And not least, of course, we've got around 8,000 staff who are office-based staff who've been predominantly working from home since March of last year. And that's a largely 50-50 split with our workforce. So half of them have been frontline working as normal, the rest of them working remotely, working from home since the pandemic. So what we've done with a lot of our comms at the moment is not just talk to that 8,000 staff who have been working from home and following the government's roadmap as to how we get them gradually and safely back into the workplace. We've really wanted to say something positive and something open about the whole of that workforce community, whatever kind of working patterns they've been engaged in. You can see there on the right, what we have done is we've developed a very simple, straightforward pledge for all of our staff, whatever their working pattern, whatever their working environment has been. I'm not sure how clear it may be for you on the slide, so apologies if it's not, but on the yellow circles to the left, you can see some of the content of our pledge to everybody. So that's all of that 27,000 staff that we've referenced. And there you can see some reference to some of the really simple, practical pledge that we want to make to everybody, which is sort of augment and improving their working environment, focus very much on making sure that their working space promotes their health, their safety, their wellness, making sure people have the right kit and tools to do their job, but also teasing out some of those other key issues that are important for us in terms of promoting and emphasising the low carbon agenda, really making sure that all of our staff, that their working environments bring the best out of them, that enable them to be productive, to be creative, and also have fun in the workplace. So it's a very simple pledge, but one of the key things we really wanted to do is talk to everybody, whatever their working environment has been over the last year. We wanted to say something to everybody. Just focusing perhaps a little bit for a minute on the 8,000 staff in Leeds who've been working from home. What we have done is we have developed a very simple model in light of the government's roadmap. And on the next slide, you'll just see how that model has panned out. And I just want to fairly quickly share with you that model. First things there to say is with those 8,000 colleagues working from home, effectively what we said is to enable you to develop your future working environment or your future working arrangements. We reckon that it's very much going to be a compromise and a balance between three different pillars. And you can see in the model what those three different pillars are. So on the orange on the top left, you can see here that this is very much about individual choice. So here we are saying to all of our 8,000 staff, we want you to have some sense of control, some sense of ownership in determining your future working pattern. So it's not just going to be us in that kind of paternalistic way telling you what your pattern will be. We want to hear what your own personal preferences are based on your own experiences. And David and also Ros talked about the unique experience and the lived experiences people have had. And we really want to capture that. And the way that we have captured that so far is invite everybody to complete an online survey. And we've got about 7,000, 6,500, 7,000 staff that have completed that they've set out those personal preferences and their own ideas. And also, of course, we're encouraging individuals to have that one-to-one conversations with their managers too. So really have that open and honest dialogue so we can really understand personal choice. Saying all of that, of course, personal choice can't be the only determinant for future working arrangements. And you can see on the right-hand side, this, the yellow bit of the wheel, that we really want to make sure that we capture service need. So what our customers are expecting and demanding, what the whole generic teams are wanting. And what we've done here is we've developed a manager toolkit, which is enabling service managers and heads of service to actually think about their service needs and service expectations and throw that into the mix. And the final bit of the jigsaw, if you like, the final bit of the model is a bit at the bottom, the green bit. This effectively is recognising that there are, of course, some corporate-wide parameters or corporate-wide expectations based on our strategy, based on our resources, what we can afford to deliver and where, and also on our values. And that also has to be thrown into that sense of sort of blend and compromise between those three different dimensions. So you can see really here we're talking very much about that good old-fashioned HR model of me, we and us. So the me being about the individual, the we being about managers and the teams that people are operating in locally, and the us being that collective organisational wide parameters and expectations. And we spend a lot of time reminding our workforce and talking to our workforce about those three different dimensions. In terms of how we set out this idea of those resources at corporate parameters, the way we've done this effectively is just develop a series of principles or expectations around these three areas you can see at the bottom of that slide, which is principles around people, around place, and around technology. And very quickly, and finally from me, if I just spend a little bit of time just sharing with you some examples of each of those principles, because it may help you if you're developing something similar. So the next slide, you can see just a snapshot of some of those principles in each of those three areas. Probably the ones most interesting for this audience are those around people. A lot of people will have read in the press about organisations setting out very clear corporate expectations about how staff should split their time between the workplace and working from home. As a council, what we're saying is that we do want, and we have said to everybody, we are expecting people to split their time in the future in the longer term between working from home and the workplace. And we're effectively saying that we're expecting the majority of people to spend most of their time working from home. So we're not giving a percentage, but we're just giving some of broad parameters to give people a little bit of corporate guidance, but recognising the other two dimensions, service need and personal choice, play into that factor too. One thing we have said quite explicitly though, which sort of teases out some of the issues raised by David and Ros as well, which is whatever working pattern people do end up with, we are suggesting that everybody should at some point, and we're saying regularly, which is different from frequently, but regularly, should come into the workplace and have that connectivity and connection with their team and their manager. So we don't want people to work exclusively from home. We don't want people necessarily to always work on the go or remotely. We really do value that sense of people touching in, coming into the workplace, meeting their team. But the degree to which they do that will depend very much on those other bits of the dimension, so service need and personal choice. Some of the other principles you can see there in terms of technology. So there's obviously their commitment from us in terms of making sure people have the right kit, and also that we're trying to build or struggle perhaps with that user IT equipment in terms of use of hybrid meetings, which is proving challenging. Interestingly, some of the key principles in terms of space and place. I'm sure a lot of you have done a lot of thinking and planning on this, but one of the key things that we're saying now is that when individuals do come into the workplace, what we're saying is that people come into the workplace for very different reasons than perhaps they did 12 months ago or 18 months ago. So when people do touch down and come into our workplace, they will do it predominantly to interact with others and predominantly to collaborate. So if it's about doing your emails or talking to people on the phone, well, you can do that anywhere. You can do that at home, you can do that in a cafe, you can do that elsewhere. But we want you to touch down and meet with people, collaborate with people in the workplace. And therefore, as a result, our buildings are now currently being redesigned accordingly. So all of those sort of banks of desks are coming out and replace them on much more of that collaborative open space. And some of our own buildings, they're not all done yet, but some of them now look and feel a bit more like coffee shops, you know, with comfier seating, more opportunity for people to meet round bigger, broader tables. One thing we have done though, as you can see there with the second principle in the workspace issue, that everybody, however, will still have what we're calling a team zone. So whatever team you're working in, you will have a base, you'll have a home where your team will be predominantly based. So that sense of connectivity and connection to your team, to the working environment, we still really want to maintain. Final thing from me really is just a final slide here, just pulling out some of the issues that other colleagues have raised. So we're very mindful about that sense of working with colleagues, building that sense of commitment and trust whilst we go through this journey. And it is a journey, we only started it in March, and really a lot of this won't land until sort of June, July, August, and then obviously we're in for the long haul. Some of the obvious things we're doing, fairly straightforward, a lot of specific support for staff. So there's a lot of number crunching and data collection. So we're pulling out all of that stuff from the toolkits and the surveys, so we understand what people are saying to us and how they feel. As you can expect, we're doing lots of roadshows going round to lots of our buildings and meeting with our teams to have the dialogue and conversation. And also, I think, Ros, you talked about this idea of sort of very much sort of listening and engaging with people. And we are inviting people to contact us in lots of different ways if they've got any particular fears or questions or worries. And people can call in, they can email, they will use our social media accounts. And actually, people are doing that. It's really interesting that people are asking us the really practical questions that people are anxious about. And we really need to make sure we have an outlet for that. And in the survey that I mentioned, we have invited people to give us a call back if they're particularly worried about issues. So there's a lot of that one-to-one engagement ongoing. I think perhaps the final thing to say is that sense of assurance, because we are very mindful about those issues of trust. So we're doing quite a lot of warming people up to that change of working environments, that change of ways of working that we referenced. So in terms of the workplace change, that we've done a lot of videos and photos introducing what they look like, inviting people to sort of phase their return so they feel that sense of confidence about their new working environment, assuring them about some of the health and safety fears. As you can expect, there's quite a lot of that ongoing. And I think perhaps a final point just to raise is linking into that wider people context, which is really important to us. So this isn't just about future ways of working, it's recognising there's a much bigger, broader people context here. So again, colleagues have talked about the role managers need to play here. So we're spending quite a bit of time thinking and reflecting on how we support our managers in terms of giving them the skills and the confidence and the expertise to manage workforce change, to manage performance, to manage productivity, because all of those are going to be challenges for our workforce and our managers. We've often banged the drum about that relentless focus on well-being, because that is underpinning throughout all of the last 12 months, but certainly will be in the future. And what we have done is we're trying to adopt that kind of benefits realisation approach, where we've surveyed probably to death, but nevertheless we've surveyed quite a lot of our workforce about how they feel in terms of their health and their happiness in the workplace. And we want to sort of do that sort of before and after, so we can sense whether or not people are having that sense of confidence and being comfortable in that change program that we're developing. And final thing really is just to say that we try to work in partnership with a lot of our city and system-wide partners. So what we're saying is that we're not just working in isolation, we are working with our partners, whether it's the NHS, other big city employers, and partly because it just generates a whole range of different opportunities for our workforce to work in different creative ways. And I think it again assures our staff that we're not in it on our own, we can work collectively, think collaboratively, and really as a city and a system-wide. So that's our journey to date. It feels like we've only been on it for a very short period of time. So I wanted to share that with you, and mindful of time, Lee. So if I just pause there, so there's the opportunity for Q&A.
Thank you very much, Andy, for sharing your organisation's experience and journey to date. And I guess highlighting the importance of communicating those big drivers to change and the broader context. So it's not just considered, I guess, and in your response to the pandemic, I think is how you described it. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to quickly go on to try and answer in the 10 minutes that we've got as many questions as possible and kind of combine some of them together. So I guess if I could ask you, Ros, to start with, there's a question early on in the session around how can we best identify which groups our people fall into? And then a kind of related question is from Liz saying, I'd love to know if the pandemic has resulted in more distinct and separate groups in organisations and how these are being actively managed, engaged and brought back into one organisation. So how do we identify where our folks sit? And then what maybe could we be doing about it, which Ros and maybe Andy, you can pick up on, please.
I think there's a number of ways that can be done. And it was great to hear Andy talking about the kind of surveys that they're doing in their workforce to really identify some of those. We've put a link to the animation that we created. It's a 7-minute animation that kind of spells out each of these different types and how you could spot them, but also what could be done to help them. And enable them, particularly the angry distrusters, to get back on track. And I think in terms of the pandemic and more segmentation of workforces, we don't know. We've got a number of things that we've been doing. I've been part of a longitudinal survey that we've taken 4 different readings with about several thousand people, and we're just number crunching at the minute. So we will come back to you. But I think, as I tried to put into my slides, I think we've got to remember that this is a dynamic situation. So just because I'm worried and I'm uncertain today, doesn't mean that that is going to be a permanent thing. There might be some aspects of the anxiety that are retained, but I think over time we will start feeling more confident about things. And so we need to be very careful about not to pigeonhole and make people feel that they're kind of ossified in their responses. It's a journey. We're all on a journey. And it's about helping them to be able to raise a hand and kind of say, I need a bit of help here.
Would you have anything to add to that, Andy, from an organisation point of view?
I think it's probably mirroring what Rosa said, because I think that's sort of the issue, that it is a journey. And one of the things to try to build in, I guess, is that sort of feedback loop and recognising that whilst people are going through, and I've talked about sort of balancing sort of 3 different dimensions, and as a result, you know, an answer being popped out, you know, in terms of this is where we've got to as an individual, but also corporately. But recognising, because it is a journey and we've not done this before, unlike a lot of sort of the HR things you tackle, you know, you've done before in a different guise or in a different way. This is quite new to us. So one of the things that we've wanted to do is sort of build in that evaluation feedback loop. So when people do or represent sort of some comfort to where they've got to, where they want to manage their working environments in the future, they have that opportunity to reflect, to review, to go back to different sources of information to say, right, this is working for me now, but may not work in the future. And that's sort of quite a challenge. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we've had, and I think some of the people have put it on the Q&A, which is this idea of how prescriptive are you? So you want individuals to have that sense of control and choice, and you want managers to give them some you know, sense of ability to direct what works for their service delivery, because they've got a job of work to do, and that sometimes can conflict. And it's that kind of delicate balance between all of those, which is a real tricky thing. And I don't think we've yet seen where we're going to get with that yet. So I think it's building in a lot of that sort of evaluation and feedback. So it's not a good answer, but it's just saying I think it's going to be quite bumpy along the way. But I think if we keep the dialogue going, hopefully we'll be able to respond to it as best we can.
Okay, no, thank you for that. Before I move on to the next question, there's quite a few questions, Andy, saying, can we share the YouTube videos that you referred
to? I can. So it is on YouTube. So I think maybe if I go through Yuli and just give you the link to that. It's only about sort of 4 or 5 minutes long, so it's not very. It's easy watching, so I'm happy to do that, yes.
No, thank you for that. I know lots of people have been asking for that, and also if there's anything you could share on the toolkits.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm sure we can do that.
Thank you. So we will share that afterwards somehow. My colleagues are probably thinking how we're going to do that, but we will. So we have a question, which is something from a kind of different perspective. So does there come a point where trust in the organisation is so damaged that it is broken thinking about how to realistically handle saboteurs? How does HR manage in this scenario? David, would you maybe like to pick up on that, and followed by Ros and maybe Andy?
Yeah, I think employment relationships can be completely broken down. That can happen at scale. We've seen organisations make decisions that are entirely at odds with what their people might have expected, and it's incredibly difficult to come back from that. I think that concept of saboteurs is a really interesting one, because there's obviously a values misalignment there. But actually, if what you're talking about is employees being noisy in a situation where something wrong is happening, or they're not being treated fairly, I think actually that's a natural outcome of the system. So I'm not sure you handle it so much as build better relationships. But there comes a point, where if things are broken down to such a level, there has to be a parting of the ways, or there has to be a genuine reconciliation based on trust and understanding. And that's why it's so important. I think the thread runs through many of the questions. Actually, it's just a question of having adult relationships, being able to say unapologetically to people, but it has to be this way, or we have to make these decisions, but giving enough transparency of information so they understand why.
Okay, no, thank you for that. Ros, would you have anything to add to that?
I think it's about understanding how that breakup in the relationship has happened. We certainly found with angry distrusters, it was often that a difficult conversation early on had not been happening. And so people ended up having very unrealistic expectations about what was going to happen for them, because managers felt ill-equipped to say difficult things to people. So I would counsel, I think, as Andy's highlighted, lots of support around line managers at this time is really, really important. But I think as a kind of corollary to that as well, easy for me to say, it's trying to understand, could it be that actually you have a rogue individual who's creating other rogue individuals? So it could be that your person who the trust has been broken with is actually a product of something bad that's happening in the rest of the organization. So certainly just identifying them as your problem child and not understanding why they're your problem child could be a very short-sighted issue. We've got on the 11th of June with the EWOP Impact Incubator, we're launching a new animation that's going to be looking a little bit about how these things can spiral in organizations, whether through stress, or it could be somebody being very deliberately counterproductive. But I always counsel, be very concerned, because just removing somebody doesn't get rid of your problem. And also, if you do it wrongly, you can actually make a small issue an awful lot worse. So yeah, be careful.
No, thank you for that, Ros. We are running out of time, but I'd quite like to ask a question that's specifically aimed at Andy, which is on a different topic again. Love the pledge to all staff. What kind of response have you had from staff, Andy?
Yeah, it's fairly early days. I think two responses I would say. First of all, a warm welcome that we're not just having this dialogue with people who've been working from home for a long time. So people are very pleased that we are reaching out and wanting to talk to everybody. So it's very much that message that everybody's important, and particularly recognising frontline staff who've worked so hard and tirelessly, throughout the last year. So there's that general sense of support and commitment that that's the right thing to do. I guess the second thing to recognise, of course, is that the anxiety about, so what will it look like, differently for me? And obviously then landing it and delivering it in all of our many sites across the city and all of our hundreds of different services is going to be really hard work. So we've got this difficulty now of trying to identify what it would mean for each individual service. Some services that may be very practical things, just in terms of improving the working environment or improving the comms and communication that Ros has talked about. others, it will be much more deep-rooted, longer-term activity. So we have to manage expectations that some of the problems and challenges some people have in some of their working environments are going to take us some time to tackle. So it's probably good that we're doing it, but query, question mark as to, so what's it mean for me and how long will it take? And we're trying to now manage that expectations, have a bit of a roadmap, a long-term view, and then I guess invite me back next year and I'll give you an update as to how that's gone.
Thank you for that. You should never offer, especially in front of people.
You're probably right.
To come back and share. So as expected, we are out of time, and we do always try to finish on to keep to strict timings for these sessions. So thank you to everyone who submitted a question. We tried our best to answer as many of them as possible, but we do review the questions that haven't been answered. And as I said at the beginning, if we're frequently updating, particularly the FAQ section of our Coronavirus Hub. So we will read the questions, reflect on what may not have been answered, and actually we can try and reflect those questions in the FAQs section. And I see that my colleagues have posted that when we upload the presentation to our COVID Hub later to the website, we can upload some of the other resources that have been referred to or requested. So it's clearly a lot for us to consider as we return to progress our plans to return to the workplace. The webinar will be available on demand later with the resources as well the slides. Do keep an eye out for future webinars. As I mentioned, our next webinar is on the 13th of May. I'd like to make a final reminder to all of you around the new wellbeing support, or the more recently launched wellbeing support for our members in the UK and Ireland. That's delivered with our workplace wellbeing provider Health Assured. And then just finally, I would just really like to thank our speakers from today, who I'm sure you will have agreed shared great insight, knowledge, expertise, and were very genuine in their responses to the questions and throughout their presentation. As with everything that's related to COVID, it's fast changing. We don't have all the answers, or not all the time anyway, but I'm sure you'll agree that they've shared a lot of great insight and content, and a lot for us to reflect on. And as Andy said, he's going to come back. So thank you, everyone. Have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you.